Welcome back to the Shepherd's Pie, a slice of faith for our messy lives. I'm Tony Kolenc, the author of inspirational fiction for teens and adults, as well as a legal columnist for Practical Homeschooling magazine and a professor at Ave Maria School of Law. This summer, I've been in the middle of writing book 3 in my Incarnate series from Chrism Press. Book 1, Incarnate, is already available, and Book 2 is due out in early 2026. We'll talk more about that, but today we're going to focus on our guest, Helen Dent, and we're going to talk about faith and fiction can help jumpstart our faith during difficult times. My guest today is Helen Dent, author of The Burning Tree, a young adult fantasy published by Enclave Escape. Helen's taught English at a Chinese university and toured in Scotland. She now lives in Texas with her husband and 3 kids, where she's active in DFW Writers Workshop, Fort Worth Poetry Society, and Art House Dallas. So, Helen, welcome to the Shepherd's Pie.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
You sound like you have a lot of fun things in your background. So maybe just give us a little bit of an intro to who you are and some of your life events that brought you to writing.
Sure. Well, I've been writing since I think I could hold a pencil. I have some very strange mashups of Chronicles of Narnia and Nancy Drew that came out at an early age, which will never see the light of day, but it's fun to watch that process beginning so early. So I studied English in college. Monster theory was a subset of English. So I was a medievalist, and I was curious about why there were always giants and dwarves walking together across a medieval landscape. And that led me down this road of why giants, why dwarves, why monsters in general, why do they pop up, and why have they been so pervasive? And then, of course, there's a bit of a monster twist in my book, not the typical kind of monster, but it made its way in there. So yes, I've been writing and spent some time in Scotland, touring Scotland. Beautiful scenery, saw it all. Sometimes stopped on the road, refilling a radiator on our road trip, and then taught in China for 2 years at a university and learned there so much about the importance of community and what it feels like to be new, completely new in a place and trying to speak, kind of like a toddler and working your way up from there, but what it feels like to be on the outside looking in and how important it is to be welcomed. So all of those, I think, have gone into my writing and just my way of looking at life.
Yeah, I was saying before we got started, my wife and I were in Scotland this summer, but just, man, so beautiful, such beautiful country up there. I can imagine the inspiration that you would have taken from that. But can you expand a little more on this monster theory? I'm kind of intrigued that you mentioned, you asked why there are such things in literature. Why is that such a thing? Can you tell us what you discovered?
Yes, so the giant and the dwarf specifically are there's a thing called the Aristotelian mean that was very important in medieval literature, and it was the idea that it's best to be in the center of a virtue, and that if you get too far to one side, you have a warped it becomes a vice. And if you go too far on the other side, it's another type of vice. So the giant is too large and the dwarf is too small. And so they're together because they're representing what the knight should not be. And so a knight often has to fight a giant because one theory is the giant represents what the knight can become. A giant comes through and destroys things, and so could a knight without a code. And so the knight has to kind of overcome that potential to be who he needs to be for the community. And sometimes monsters flip, even in medieval literature, and kind of help make the hero rethink his or her perspective. And so sometimes, like in Frankenstein's monster, the monster is not what we thought of as the monster, but maybe we need to interrogate something about ourselves that is monstrous in ourselves. So it works both ways. It's something that needs to be overcome sometimes, and sometimes it's something that we need to rethink.
Interesting. You mentioned Nancy Drew in the Chronicles of Narnia. I think all of us writers probably have similar things in our drawers that will never see the light of day. Mine were like combinations of like Raiders and the Lost Ark and Star Wars when I was
Yeah.
a kid writing this stuff. But like you said, it's a process. So maybe, talk a little bit about why a fantasy novel and how did you come about making this the one that you really followed through on?
I put aside writing for a while because I looked at it and I thought, this is not book quality. When I grew older than seven or something and was starting to be more self-critical about what I was writing. And so I had the wrong idea that writing was something that you just sat down and a book emerged if you were good at it. And then if that didn't happen, then it meant that you weren't meant to write. And I have learned that that is not the case at all for most people. A few people maybe can sit down and write a book, but by and large, that is the exception rather than the rule. And when I picked up writing again, just about 10 years ago, the stories that I wrote were set in the real world, our world, but they had always this element of something in the world that was wondrous, something in the world that was beyond the ordinary. And I think that that's connected to my faith in that I see the world as kind of charged with the grandeur of God, as Gerard Manley Hopkins said. And so if I'm writing about just reality, just the stuff of the world that we can see, I want to turn up the volume on that part of the world that sometimes we don't see, but is very much there. And so in the story that I wrote, that saw the light of day is a tree, but I went through several iterations of this in different books of this magical element that's weaving its way through that people have to interact with, and that will bring them to a deeper understanding of themselves and of the world around them.
So, all right, so tell us a little bit about the premise of the story and what you think might be intriguing to somebody who might want to buy such a book.
So the premise of the story is that there is a girl who lives in a town with a feud and a curse. So the setting is contemporary. It's kind of like rural Appalachia. There's just been a feud between the two main families in the town for as long as anyone can remember. And every once in a while, a scorch mark will show up on the door of one of the feuding families' houses, and a curse will fall on that family. Like a well will go bitter, or orchards will die. And there's never anything physically wrong, so there's nothing that anyone can do to fix it. And at the beginning of the book, the mark hits Ellie's house, my character's house, and her little sister Jean gets sick in a coma, but there's nothing physically wrong with her, so there's nothing that anyone can do to help her. So when this happens, the community, the affected family will go into the middle of the forest and carve that person's name, their initials, into what's called the burning tree. And they said one time that reversed what happened to that family. So they go in, they carve her sister's initials into this tree, and nothing happens. So my character decides it's connected somehow, the tree and the curse. And she goes in and she burns down the tree. And when she comes out of the forest, there's a mark on every door in town, and one person from each house is sick like her sister. And so then she has to figure out what's actually going on and work with her nemesis from the other family.
Yeah, now by setting it in a contemporary rural town, unlike some fantasy novels that are just in a totally made up world or universe, how do you build faith into that? I know in some fantasy novels, they can make up their own gods and their own religions and everything, but you're working in the real world. Does faith impact any of the characters?
What I do with the idea of faith in this story in particular is come at it in the sense of the wonder in the world. So, and Shakespeare actually plays a big role in it. So, my goal for this book is that it reaches an audience that is wide. And it's sort of the idea that it's more like Tolkien than Lewis, in other words, that there is more at play in the world than people realize. And that whole idea, but I don't have anything specific in the book that is like that people are going to church, but the themes are self-sacrifice and forgiveness, and it's kind of opening the door to that idea.
No, it's interesting when you talk about that because one of the writers groups that I'm involved with, we often have this discussion about faith and writing and explicit versus not explicit, and the pros and cons of such a thing, depending on the
Right.
audience you're trying to reach. But at the end of the day, we're coming, all of us are coming from some sort of a worldview. For those of us who are coming from things with a Christian worldview, tends to permeate, into everything that we do and write. So I don't know, maybe if you can talk a few minutes here about, how you see this, worldview and faith on behalf of the writer, any of the community.
So I belong to two writing communities. One community is faith-based. Everyone has the same worldview, and in one community it doesn't. And my view on faith-based, whether it should be explicit or implicit, is that it depends on the story and who the audience is. So I have quite a few writings that are based solely toward a Christian audience, and I'm more, of course, explicit in those. And then when I'm writing to a wider audience, the themes go more implicit, but it's the same themes. I mean, I just feel like I'm playing something in a different key. And so what my hope is that my writing, what I write, and when I'm in a group that has people from very different worldviews, when they find out I'm a Christian, it's not a surprise. And kind of the stories have gone before me. It's easy to say, I have Christian values, but what does that mean? I feel like the stories put feet and legs and hands on what I mean when I say I'm a Christian. So I feel like in some ways the stories are going before me when I'm in a group of people with different worldviews, so that when they do know that I'm a Christian, they've seen what I mean by that by the story. And I think that's very important sometimes in as our culture is going more and more post-Christian in some ways. I think a lot of people have an idea of what Christian means that may not be the core of what we would say our worldview is. And I think stories can be a really powerful way to show this is when I say I'm a Christian, this is what this looks like in the world. My imagination of what it means to be a Christian in the world is this. And I think it's very different and sometimes surprising to people when they think of it in a certain way, or if they've just seen it in certain, I don't know, statements, and they don't see it in lived out in practice.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting as you were saying that the Apostle James came to my mind, and the whole discussion he has in there about faith and works. And,
Mhm.
faith without works is dead, and I'll show you my faith by my works. And in some ways, it sounds like in your writing and in a lot of our writing, we're showing by living out sort of a Christian worldview. Do you find that those kinds of themes are working their way into your Burning Tree novel?
Definitely. The wages of sin is death is the theme of this book. This tree is absorbing what it has seen in the world through this feud, and then it is perpetuating it out in the very environment. And so it's like this cycle that's feeding itself. And people are hearing one side, right, of their story, and then the bitterness and resentment, it just grows and grows until somebody is willing to say, actually, I am not wanting to do this anymore. And because I'm in this particular situation, what it's going to take is for me to sacrifice myself. And so that theme is definitely running through the book. I think that is a huge power of story. You're saying, the faith without works and showing it in our life, showing works and showing the works through stories. Tolkien, I think, calls that getting past the watchful dragons. Like there can be these knee-jerk reactions to these ideas. But stories have a way of kind of creeping around and showing it in a different way. And I also wanted to say something about the idea of characters making bad decisions. And I think that's why the arc of the book is so important, because if you take out a section of a book, a character can be making a terrible decision in that moment. And that's part of maybe their downward spiral. That they're not there always to be the hero of that particular moment. Sometimes a book has that and someone is heroic all the way through, but sometimes they are going down in order to learn something that they're going to need to go back and fix the problem. it's important to look at the whole arc of the book when you are looking at the message, because if you look at just individual moments, that character could be making really bad decisions. And my character does in this book, makes quite a series of very bad decisions. And because she has this lie that she's believing and it's driving her, and she has to confront that in order to be able to. And she doesn't confront it on her own. She has to confront it with the help of others to be able to actually fix the problem.
Yeah, that's really important because there, I mean, and this maybe is the difference between, having the license to, write something that isn't maybe explicitly Christian. Because there are, I know, some Christian publishers who might hesitate to publish something if the protagonist is doing something that is sinful or not good. And as you mentioned, I mean, a lot of storytelling is showing the consequences of our actions. And the
Hmm.
only way to do that is showing your protagonist sometimes doing things that, of course, you would never want your reader to do. And oftentimes you have to see how those decisions are going to play out so that we can learn in our own lives. And so maybe this is a good segue into this idea of how fiction can even help, whether it's explicitly Christian or not, can help in our own faith as a reader, as a fellow writer. When you're reading somebody else's fiction, is this really value to a Christian's faith? Being fiction just sort of like an entertaining pastime?
Yeah, that's such a great question. As far as the value of fiction and looking at other people's trajectories, I think one really important thing about looking at a character's trajectory is and sinful things that they may do is if that is ultimately glorified or not. Because if it's glorified, that's in a completely different category. But if it is shown like the wages of sin is death, that is mirroring the world God made. I listened to Jonathan Rogers of the Habit podcast, and that's one thing that he talks about a lot is do stories, fantasy or otherwise, how do they mirror the world that God made? And I think that that is one of the prime values of stories. And that when someone is looking closely at the world, it reflects it in a small way. And we can look at a small slice of that, as it were. And when we see someone making a bad decision over and over, and we think, no, no, don't do that, it is it is kind of a shortcut to wisdom, I think. Like we're watching someone else take a path, and then we think, I don't really want to walk down that path. I've seen what happens at the end of that path, and I don't want that. And I think also they've done studies recently where when someone's reading and they read about someone taking a particular action, it's almost like it's happening to them. And so it is also a way of expanding empathy, I think. I have read several stories where the protagonist's life experience was very different from my own, and it has transformed the way I saw the world. It has increased my capacity, I think, sometimes for charity, for love, to just see things from a different perspective. And I mean, that's good anyway, to like break out of this little vision of the world that is so limited and see it through other people's eyes with the guidelines of the Christian worldview always in play, but to expand it into feeling what somebody else has felt and not going down certain roads that other people have gone down or other characters have gone down and thinking, well, that I don't want that. But I do want this. This is very beautiful, like this idea of sacrifice or just perseverance and just plugging along at something that doesn't ever seem like it's going to end, like that trek in The Lord of the Rings, and just keeping on steady. I think there's a lot of value to that. I think it forms our imagination in particular ways that can help what we believe in our minds and what we believe in our hearts come into line.
Yeah, and of course, coming at it from a Christian worldview, we know that there are universal truths. And so our writing and the fiction that we read and that we're writing needs to reflect those truths because if not, they're not going to resonate with people. Like if you could read something and realize, yeah, I mean, it might be an interesting piece of writing, but that doesn't really reflect the truth of humanity. And because of that, it will fall flat sometimes because it just doesn't resonate. We know that that's not really the way the world works. That's not really the way people act or react. or grow or fail to grow because we've lived long enough to kind of recognize that. And there's that sort of natural truth that we're, you know, resonating in our hearts just as humans. And I feel like as an author, I've grown in my own personal life of faith by sort of writing these characters and it's one thing for a reader to experience it, but I don't know, maybe you can talk to this for a minute. As an author, do you find that you yourself also grow by putting your characters through these things?
Yes, in several ways. I mean, you spend so much time with this particular journey, and if it's reflecting something that's true, I think that it's kind of like it becomes a meditation on something that's just a true, and you're trying to make it as accurate as you can to the story, and then it just becomes you're just immersed in that idea and that theme, and I think that's absolutely true. And just the discipline of actually getting into a story world and losing yourself in that. I think that that's a discipline too, to be able to kind of listen and watch. I think it makes it easier for me than to listen and pay attention in other contexts too, because I'm not always thinking about myself and my feelings and how am I today. And, I'm looking at something else. But I think that one of the main ways that I've grown spiritually through this process is actually taking criticism of my work. Because it was very difficult at first, and sometimes it still is when I take something into a writing group and read a chapter, and people say, well, this worked well, but this did not work well. At first, it was really hard to take that. And then I would incorporate it into my writing and realize, oh, this actually makes it really much better. And so now my perspective is like, please tell me what is going on with this so I'm eager for it in a way that I was definitely not eager for it at the beginning. And I've seen that parallel in the Christian life as well. The iron sharpens iron idea. It's helped me to see it in a small way in my writing, how much better my this one chapter has gotten from people's input who are wiser than I am. And then sometimes in our lives, it's harder to see. Like the journey is longer, the journey takes more time, and the formation of virtue in us can take a long time. And so it's not always like, oh, well, I've incorporated this and now it's so much better, but it's the same principle. And so it's easier for me now to take also input on spiritual disciplines, my spiritual walk. Not that it's easy, but it's easier because I've seen the principle at work in other areas of life as well.
Absolutely. And so, curious, are you working on any new projects? And can you talk about that at all?
I am working on new projects. I can't talk about the details of it, except that it is a different world than The Burning Tree. It's not a series. The Burning Tree was a standalone with a completed story arc. But what I'm working on now is another young adult book, and it's the same idea of this world, but with something different. The volume turned up on something that we all experience. Right in the burning tree, the volume is turned up on resenting other people and bitterness and that kind of cycle that we can get caught in. And this is something different. This is looking at connections between people and getting so caught up in the connections that we're forgetting about the actual people. And so that's the idea of this one. This world with a little bit, the volume turned up on an element in it.
All right. So, Helen, if folks want to get a hold of The Burning Tree or learn more about you or your writings, where would you like them to go?
They can go to the Enclave website to get a hold of the Burning Tree, or it's also on Amazon. And I am at Helen Dent Writes. That's my website, and that's also my Instagram handle. So you can catch up with me both of those places.
Wonderful. Final question before we wrap up then. If you've got folks who are out there who maybe you're not big readers, any advice to them on making sure they're going to find something edifying and real and human and truly resonating?
Yes, well, I would always start with the Inklings, right? C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, if you like mystery, Dorothy Sayers, and then see who is coming after them. S.G. Smith, Andrew Peterson, all enclave titles. And so The Inklings, Enclave, and just look at who those authors are reading and recommending as well. So I think so much is about relationship and community, and these authors are holding up other authors and saying, "Look at that! This has been great," and who's interviewing who. And I think that that's a really good segue into it. Is starting with authors that you know that you can trust, and then seeing who are they reading and who are they recommending.
I think that's great advice. And I've appreciated having you on the show today. This is great. The Burning Tree actually sounds fascinating and relevant to polarized worlds. It sounds like this is exactly the kind of message that our young people need to be learning about in an entertaining format. So thank you so much for being on the show today.
Well, thank you again for having me. Enjoyed our conversation.
Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for the show. We've been speaking with Helen Dent about faith fiction and her fantasy novel. Again, this is Antony Barone Kolenc. If you want to learn more about my writings, you can find more about me on my website, antonykolenc.com. Until next time, may God bless us as we rely on our faith to work through the messy challenges of our lives.